Hey guys, BeGoodBurb here, and today we're here to be attacked in the comments, because I finally caved and made a Monolith defense tier list. I've been procrastinating doing this for a while now, but when one of the devs directly asked me to, I kinda have to. Before we get directly into the list, this list was made during alpha version 0.7.7, aka the Turbo Troublemakers update. Any towers or reworks added after this update will not be here. As well, this is mostly based on my knowledge of the game, so if I get anything wrong, blame the fact that I've been playing with Ascension 3 stats for like a year now. And so without any further ado, let's get into the tier list. Starting from the very bottom of the list, we have the 3 D tier towers. First, at the very bottom of the list is Icicle Factory. Shame that a tower obtained from one of the hardest game modes is at the bottom tier, but Icicle Factory just doesn't fit in with this game's meta. A leak guard, it just isn't needed, especially with how little the game punishes you for leaking with how you handle taking damage. As well, it's very easy to just brute force and not have to leak at all. And it's not even like this thing is good at leak guarding. The stats just aren't really that good at all. Barnacles is next, and this tower is just sad. It hasn't been good in the year and a half I've been playing, and the recent rework to it didn't really help that much, as it just takes a while to do any major damage to enemies, and especially in the aquatic faction, you have way better options. Pufferfish is our last unit in D tier. It's just generally bad. Its poison damage is meh. It's generally just outclassed by everything else. If you want damage over time, just start maining radiation. Our first tower here is Glacial Artillery. This tower barely made it out of D tier. The reason is because there's very niche cases in which you want to use this thing. Specifically, if you want to make a Frost only loadout and don't own Everfrost Elemental or Sub-Zero or Railgun, then you can maybe get use out of it. But in most game modes where you would be doing that, you can easily use something else as DPS, because this thing just is not built good. It's a cliff tower that takes up so much space. With how the free play maps are already limited in cliff space, and most other times you're playing with multiple people who may or may not have cliff towers themselves, which taking up that much space is not going to help anything. It's also just way overpriced for what its stats are. And just in general, this thing's meh. Axolotl is one of the towers I don't have too much experience with. It's relatively low damage, and the crowd control isn't really that necessary in this game for the most part. I mean, it can be helpful in early game, but I don't think there's any really cases where you will need this. And plus, if you want to do early game with Aquatic, just use other units. There's more viable options out there. Atomic Lizard is generally just a sad case. As of right now, it is a big issue of getting spam stunned, or just not having a good target. It can getting good value, but it's always such a niche case that can be overshadowed by a certain other unit. But just generally, the high single target damage really going to be helpful, considering that most of the strong things in this game can just be taken out by things that will also take out the other smaller enemies. Next is Mutant. The poor thing just always gets outclassed. There's no real glaring flaws within its design like some of the other units. It just generally has low stats. This is one of the few towers I think would benefit from just a general stat buff. Maybe some changes would be made to its how it functions, but generally this thing just has low stats. Now we get onto the towers that people actually use. Starting with Tentacle. Similar to Glacial Artillery, this thing barely made it into here because this thing fell off hard. For context, this thing used to be an S tier tower, where its third tech used to stun every single hit. You could stun enemies that weren't bosses very easily. It would be really good for stages like Winter Stage 4, which had very strong enemies that were really susceptible to getting stun locked. But now it only stuns every third hit, and that does not do nearly as well as stun locking. And generally, if you want stall, there's better options, or you could just go for a tower that'll just kill the enemies. There's pretty much no reason to use this thing over anything else in the aquatic faction. Next is Marine, which is a sad case of a tower, but in which it did get a buff when it needed it, but the buff didn't really do enough, in my opinion. Its third tech got a massive buff, in which that now it gets supercharged when every third reload, but the problem is it's just way too inconsistent. They didn't buff any of its other stats, as far as I'm aware, and it still has generally low damage output comparatively to other things in its faction. It's basically entirely outclassed by the ability version of it, which is kind of funny to me. But yeah, generally this thing is not super good, though you can get some use out of it. Everfrost Elemental is an interesting case, because at least for me it's an auto-include in most Frost loadouts. Well, that is at least if you own it, but after it got brought back it's pretty common now. But I just don't think it's too amazing. It's just really reliant on longer maps, in my opinion. And just generally, it's more of on the crowd control side, though it can do good DPS. And Frost faction already has decent crowd controllers. And Everfrost also just generally doesn't, like, help out a whole lot. Like, you're not, like, losing value by investing into it like you would with, like, Icicle Factory, but it's generally not, like, amazing to invest into. Usually I just invest into it because there's nothing else to do. Abyssal Cave is another niche case unit. It could be really good for stuff like killing the Patient Zero spawns, but in pretty much any case it'll be pretty bad considering its slow spawn time, and also just, like, slow speed in general. Making it so it takes forever to get to the front of the map. But, I mean, it does kind of make up for that, but it just kind of drags rounds on forever. It's really only helpful in, like, very specific niche cases. Sadly, I had to put my Shotgunner bias aside for this list. Shotgunner is generally an okay unit. Its damage output is pretty good, but the low range and cap of 3 on its spread, it kind of hold it back a lot. And its third tech just kind of sucks in general, especially in a faction that's focused on being able to pierce defense. So yeah, it's kind of sad that I got put this low, but I kind of have to. Now here's Ice Harvester and Supply Hanger. I'm talking about these two in unison because they both serve the same role of economy. Supply Hanger has been the underdog for a long while. Even before Harvester was added, it was kind of sucky because generally the economy wasn't necessary. And it had issues being able to pay itself back, being that it was too costly for the money output it gave. And then when Ice Harvester came out, it just completely overshadowed it. The only reason you would use Supply Hanger over Ice Harvester is if you were trying to spawn kill. But, I mean, that's only really a thing if you're trying to do speed runs. Or, like, you know, stuff for grinding efficiency. But then after Ice Harvester got hit with the wombo combo of a double nerf, and Supply Hanger got its useless second tech made actually good, I'd say Supply Hanger is the better option now. Generally, it has more cases in which it would be useful. Personally, I think all of free play, though really a noob, you don't really need the economy, but it's not like it's bad there. As well as being good in Summer Stage 4 due to the high wave count, and Turbo Troublemakers due to the generally low economy in that game mode, as well as needing high cost units to be able to kill the boss. Supply Hangers just generally serves more cases than Ice Harvester, which is really only good in Raid and maybe Winter Stage 4. But yeah, so generally, I'd say Supply Hanger is the better unit here. Now here are all the towers that I think are in a pretty good place. They don't really need any changes. First we have Coral Reef and Radar. Another two at once, but they're both here for similar reasons. These two are support units for their factions, and most of the time they're auto-include in loadouts, but they don't really impact the game as much as the actual units they buff. In my opinion, Radar is the better one because of its level 6 upgrade and also having the ability to give military towers hidden detection, which military is the faction with a DPS that doesn't have hidden detection. So yeah, that's like really, really good. Also, bonus points on Radar Tower for having the better tech tree. Next is Pumpkin Trickster. The only factionless tower as of right now, and it's very versatile, but in the way where it can do so many things that's not good at any one thing, and you don't really see it anymore. Everybody was talking about it when it first came out because it was pretty powerful, but then people really stopped using it because it lagged out the game and there were just better options. It's lack of being buffed by a tech tree or a support tower, well, aside from Nuke Silo, but though it does have that insane tech tree to make up for it, and the tech's being kind of crazy good. Legion of Frost is a good unit. There's not really much else to say about it. It's pretty easy to protect the units to have them be able to rack up good DPS. And the units have pretty high range and stack rather well. It just doesn't really do as well as some of the other units you'd bring in the Frost faction setup. Sniper is honestly such an underrated unit. It has crazy good range and is very cheap. It also can stack damage up with a third tech perk. Its only downfall being it's a spammable cliff tower, which those two really don't work together because of the limited cliff spaces in this game. But if you can get it to work, it will work well. Lava Creeper is a pretty cool unit. Well, I mean, not really. It's made out of lava. But in any case, it does really good damage, has the best range in the game that isn't really infinite. It's also an aquatic tower and has splash damage. It's usually just that you'd rather invest into a certain stupidly OP fish instead, but regardless, you can still get use out of this unit. Demo is another underrated military unit. After the nerf it got, everybody stopped talking about it despite how great this unit still is. Personally, it isn't my cup of tea because I like the faster attacking units that are in the military faction, but Demo still works wonders if you try to do something you aren't a little bit over-prepared for. It's especially good in game modes like Raid or Sub-Zero Chills because of their hordes of enemies. Especially in Sub-Zero Chills with the summons that happen there, Demo's pretty good there. As well, the mines that he throws, those are insanely good because of the splash slow effect. It's crazy. Acid Sprayer is a unit that only somewhat recently has gotten attention. It's got great damage with AoE and overtime damage for very cheap. It would pretty much be the de facto radiation of the game if there weren't several cases in which another unit is outright better, but Acid Sprayer isn't really ever a bad choice per se. Fuser is the next unit on the list. It's higher up than the other supports due to having the most aggressive buffs in a faction that doesn't really need extra range, being that it has both fire rate and damage buff rather than having fire or damage plus range like the rest of the buffers do. It also has a secondary buff, kind of like Radar, in which it buffs freeze time, which is really good. Snowman is a unit that gets too much hate. He's the Frost faction's only source of cheap hidden detection, and he can easily be backed in by Everfrost if you need more damage on those hidden enemies. It also lets you trigger freeze-reliant abilities on hidden enemies, kind of like, for example, Ice Harvester's Money Gain. And it also does pretty good DPS, being that I think it's 60 if you have it maxed with Freezer, which is pretty good for how cheap it is. Irradiated Nest being here might get me questioned in the comments, but this tower isn't as good as everyone says it is. First off, the lag this thing causes. This is like the laggiest tower in the game, and the lag is unavoidable. Every time you use Bird, you will get some kind of lag, especially if you start spamming the cost-efficient levels. Similar to Everfrost, it also relies on the longer maps to make use of its infinite range ability. It also has to rely on other towers not only to be able to actually be able to damage enemies that are in like a crowd, because this thing fires so slowly and it also has travel time that all of them are going to attack the same thing, and it's not really going to do a whole lot of damage to a crowd of enemies. It also needs something else to apply radiation or fallout to actually be able to have the infinite range. It's just reliant on a lot of things, and usually there's just something better to run, at least in my opinion. Though it still does have that really good damage output, and it's definitely one of the best boss killers, especially if you're going into things underprepared. Chemical Plant is an amazing unit that gets overlooked because of the people who try to lag out the game with it. It's really easy to avoid lagging out the game, you just have to space them out a bit. Sure, you might get some lag, but it's negligible. The early levels have really high HP and a radiation bubble upon death, which can easily take out a crowd of enemies for you. Later levels have the insanely good turrets, which can just easily wipe out a crowd of enemies, or weaken something so the Chem Plant can tank it and keep shooting with the turrets. And then it also gets that cannon at max level, which can just obliterate a crowd of enemies if it feels like it. Chem Plant is just overall an underrated unit. At long last, we've reached S tier. All of these towers probably need a nerf in some capacity, but most of them probably aren't going to get nerfed. First is Radiation Emitter. This is what Aster wishes he could be. Emitter applies full range radiation damage, and it's incredibly cheap for what it does. It'll let you sit around and do anything you want in early game. You want to set up supply hangars? Sure. You want to save for an expensive tower to be able to deal with something early? Go ahead. I mean, it gives you a lot of freedom to do with your early game, which is really nice to have, especially in stuff like Turbo Troublemakers, which is really tight in my opinion. If it doesn't exactly kill an enemy, then you're going to be in a bit of trouble, but it's easy to just have some money stored up to be able to place something quickly if that happens. Fission Commando is a crazy good unit. Its level 2 can make enemies take 15% more damage for only $2,200. As well, the later upgrades of Fission can do upwards of 300 damage, which is very good for its fire rate and its cost, as well as still applying that 15% damage. It's actually so good that I can solo multiple game modes by itself, which I didn't even think was possible. I'm pretty sure it's been done on every game mode. I'm not 100% sure. I'll fact check that in editing. 50 cal is another really good unit. The case for this being, at level 6 at Ascension 3, it can do over 3,000 DPS, though it does have massive drawbacks. It has the highest stun priority in the game, and it's also $30,000 to max. It also has a cone-shaped range, making it really inefficient most of the time. But if you can get a good spot on this will tear through anything in its path. Snowblower is a tricky unit to get a hold of, but well worth the trouble. It boasts high AoE DPS, as well as being able to freeze enemies with ease. It's really great for early game if you have something else to kill hiddens, like the reinforcements ability, or just, general abilities if you want to place something else to kill hiddens afterwards. But if you don't want to use it for early game, it's still a great unit in the mid to late game, just generally as a supporting damager, crowd control, or just stalling the enemies. So here's Cadet. Funny how the starter unit is this high up, isn't it? 8.25 DPS for $125 may not seem that good, but when you look into it, you can place a few of these with your starting cash and still have a lot left over. My favorite thing to do is to set up supply hangars, orbital laser the first wave, and get a few cadets down. You get a head start on your farming, and you have early game covered. It's a great combo. Oh, and did I mention that this unit can solo Amalgam? Granted, you need radar towers to support, but may I remind you that this is the starter tower, and you also pretty much get Ascension 1 of this for free by playing the starter missions. Yeah, this is an easy S tier. Nuke Silo is far and away the best support tower. Not only is it on a pretty great faction being Radiation, but it buffs splash damage along with damage in range. As well, it buffs any tower that has splash damage, or just AoE in general. Like, for example, it can buff Demo, it can buff Lava Grouper, it can buff Snowblower, it can buff Pumpkin Trickster. This thing just buffs so much, and it also has an ability that lets you do damage in an AoE to enemies using a nuke that you can use every wave. The damage may not be the best, but it's every wave, it's free damage. It also has the Overdrive ability, which doubles the buffs it gives for one wave.
granted on a 3-wave cooldown. Pretty much the only downside to this thing is its buffs are relatively low compared to the other buffer towers, but this thing just has so many upsides that it doesn't even matter. Sub-Zero Railgun is the only one here that I wouldn't say needs a nerf, but this is purely because of how hard it is to get. I mean, this thing is powerful. It gains more damage every single time something in its range is frozen, on top of already having crazy good damage. So this thing has crazy good range. Like, did you see this? It's the most expensive tower as long as having a 2 placement limit. And it takes up a lot of space. I'm pretty sure it's the highest placement footprint in the game. But it's well worth all of that. Because of it actually having downsides, it's only the second best tower in this game in my opinion. With the best tower in the game being the deep one. It's relatively cheap, it has absurd damage, absurd range, and absurd fire rate. As well, it gains damage on every kill, has no placement limit, and barely has to worry about stuns due to spamming them being so effective. There is nowhere in the game where this thing could even remotely be a downside. The extra space it takes up is not even an issue considering the aquatic faction is all about spamming. And so, they decided to give you so much space in all of the maps. So you don't even have to worry about that. And then you get even more range from schooling. It's just absurd. They nerfed this thing by making it gain less damage from Ravenous buff at lower levels. It also happens to upgrade the previous stacks gained when you upgrade it to higher levels. Yeah. So definitely the top of S tier. And that concludes my Monolith defense tier list. Here's the final list if you guys need it for anything. But thank you guys for watching. I had lots of fun making this video, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it. If you want to make your own list, the format that I used on Tier List Maker will be in the description. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Big Red Barb out.